Good afternoon, and welcome to this month's Lunch with the Libraries and Museums. It is our ongoing speaker series that spotlights the unique collections, pioneering initiatives, and outstanding staff of the Sheridan Libraries and University Museums. My name is Claire Miller, President of the Friends Advisory Council. The Friends of the Libraries are one of the oldest university library support groups in the United States. Since 1931, we have provided financial support, advocacy, and volunteer assistance for events like this one for members of the campus and the wider community. If you are not already a friend, I encourage you to join us in our mission to ensure that the libraries remain one of the university's strongest assets, the heart of the intellectual life at Hopkins. Today's conversation focuses on a new exhibition at the George Peabody Library titled Gertrude Stein in Circles, Spheres of Life and Writing. This exhibit will be on view through March 2nd, 2025. It showcases the rarely displayed first editions, drafts, correspondence, photographs, and Stein ephemera from the Robert A. Wilson collection. Joining us is the exhibition's curator, Gabrielle Dean, who will discuss some of the collection's highlights. Paul Espinosa, curator of the Peabody Library, will moderate our Q&A. Thank you, Paul and Gabrielle, for joining us today.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks to everyone out there in the audience for being here today. Welcome to Gertrude Stein in Circles, Spheres of Life and Writing. This is an exhibition at the George Peabody Library in Baltimore, but we're bringing it to you virtually today. It examines the life and work of the American writer Gertrude Stein, who was born in 1874 and died in 1946, using the idea of circles in a couple of different senses. So first we have circles in the sense of a social circle. So the exhibition is organized into 6 different social circles, roughly speaking, that shaped Stein as a person and as a writer, or which defined her legacy. And I'm also interested in circularity as a feature of her writing, which was famous or infamous for a lot of meandering sentences and repeated words, which kind of create an experience of a kind of, well, a cyclical experience. The exhibition draws primarily on the prized collection of Robert A. Wilson, Johns Hopkins alum, class of 1943, who became a major Gertrude Stein collector. You can see in this photo what books he's holding. I've also drawn from some other Sheridan Libraries holdings and created an additional Gertrude Stein collection to supplement Wilson's, and borrowed a few important items from local institutions. Baltimore is a little bit of a hotbed of Stein materials. So the materials you'll see here come from several sources, but the core of it is Wilson's collection. Stein, gave her papers and manuscripts to Yale University shortly before the Second World War as a way of protecting them, getting them out of Europe. So Robert Wilson was not initially in search of her notebooks or letters. Those were mostly already at Yale. But he was especially interested in her publications. Again, look what he's holding, some books. And a lot of those were out of print when he started to collect. He wanted to create a comprehensive bibliography of Stein's work. He used his own collection to help him create that bibliography. And, a couple generations of scholars are really grateful that he did. But along the way of collecting books and publications, he also collected many interesting documents, books, I said those, ephemeral materials, artifacts that testify to Stein's impact in her time and beyond. And I think that in this regard, Wilson's collection really is unique and transformative. Here's a photo of the 30 boxes in the archives part of the collection, and there's also close to 1,300 bound items, books, and periodicals. I had to narrow that down to 155 objects in the gallery, which is still a lot, but it was hard. Today, we'll be looking at a few highlights that represent the most important through lines in the exhibition. The first circle that was important to Stein was her family, of course. So here you see a few family photographs. Stein with her mother, Amelia, as an infant. This is a photograph that was taken in Baltimore, even though Stein was born in Pittsburgh and her family was living there at the time. Her parents were both from Baltimore and were members of Baltimore's large middle-class German Jewish community. The next photo is Stein as a little girl taken in Vienna, Austria. Her father, Daniel, thought that his 5 children should have a European education. So he took his branch of the family business to Paris and Vienna for a couple of years. And after that, when they moved back to the States, they moved to Oakland, California. But Stein and her closest brother, Leo, did spend some significant time back in Baltimore after their parents died. So on the right, you see some beautiful portraits of the two of them that were taken in Baltimore by their uncle, who was the famous portrait photographer, David Bachrach. And we're fortunate to have in this collection a few items from Stein's own library. I'm not going to say too much about these. They're just representative, I think, of something really important that Stein inherited from her family, which was a love for learning. And, you know, she and Leo, I think, kind of survived the death of their parents by becoming even more voracious readers than they already were. So, you know, her family relationships really shaped her in that way. There was closeness and there was calamity. But she persevered. And, you know, one of the things that, you know, a lot of people don't know about Stein is that she sort of started out as a scientist, not so much a writer. She enrolled in what was then called the Harvard Annex, later Radcliffe College. And at Radcliffe, she got terrible grades for English composition, but she loved the sciences. She studied with the philosopher and psychologist William James, who, and also with an early advocate of experimental psychology named Hugo Munstenberg. And just like we try to encourage, you know, students today to do a lot of hands-on learning, she was doing hands-on learning. She was encouraged to carry out experiments and publish the results, which she did. Her first ever publications were in these issues from 1896 and 1898 of the American Psychological Review. She was, you may not be surprised to hear this, she was especially interested in subconscious experience and ideas about psychological types. After she finished at Radcliffe, she applied to and was accepted at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. And here you can see her actual application form to the School of Medicine, which is in the Chesney Medical Archives here at Hopkins. You can also see a textbook from one of her favorite teachers at Hopkins, an anatomy professor. And here she is in the class photo of 1901, also from the Chesney Archives. She did really well the first couple of years, and then she didn't do so well. And she later said that she was bored, but we also imagine that probably it wasn't the most hospitable atmosphere for women medical students in the very late 19th century and early 20th century. And the other thing that was going on for Stein was that she was involved in a very, you know, difficult love triangle. She was in love with a woman who was in love with another woman. And she probably just felt depressed. So she pulled a geographic move. She moved to Paris and moved in with her brother Leo into a little apartment on the Rue de Fleurus. near the Luxembourg Gardens. On the other side of her is their brother Michael, and he and his family moved into another apartment nearby. So this move really changed the trajectory of her life quite significantly because it put her into contact with a crowd of avant-garde artists, writers, and art collectors, which catalyzed her emerging practice as a writer. She was in this avant-garde environment, but ironically, what really got her started as a writer, what really kind of catalyzed her, was a 19th century book, a 19th century set of stories by Gustave Flaubert, the famous French novelist. He put 3 novellas together into this book called Trois Contes, and she was especially interested in the one called Un Coeur Simple. And it really found in this materials for a new approach to writing, to writing a story that she'd been trying to write for several years, the story of her own romantic triangle. So you can see on the spine there that one of the 3 lives, her book, which she self-published in 1909, is a story called Melanctha. And there, in that story, she really transposes the genders and the races from her own experience onto these characters, turning it into the story of an African-American woman torn between 2 possible male partners in a fictionalized version of Baltimore. So while she was writing this, after she was writing this, you have to remember she was in the middle of this major crash course in art appreciation in this extremely exciting environment of Paris in the early 20th century. Stein and her siblings began to collect works of art that challenged traditional European techniques of representation. They started with Japanese prints. That was kind of like the gateway drug to Cézanne, Picasso, Matisse, these artists who were actually themselves drawing on non-Western modes of representation. And many of these artists were coming to hang out with Gertrude and Leo at their salon at the Rue de Fleurus. One of those, you've probably heard this story, was Picasso. Picasso invited Gertrude to sit for him for a portrait, and the portrait, which you can see here in reproduction in camera work. This portrait was really pivotal to his development of Cubism, and she, in turn, wrote word portraits. She wrote word portraits of Picasso, of Matisse, a lot of other friends, and you can see the sort of nice sort of exchange going on here. She published 2 of hers also in camera work, an art photography journal edited by Alfred Stieglitz. Stein continued to write word portraits for several decades, and Picasso was a frequent subject. What was really, I guess, useful about this genre of writing for her is that it gave her a platform for her ideas about the subconscious that she, developed as a scientist, and thinking about how it gets expressed in a person's temperament. And she coupled that kind of psychological insight with an approach to writing that was deliberately not representational in the same way that Cubism was not representational. She wanted to use words to create something that felt more like a direct encounter with the subconscious of the person she was writing about. So we can almost say she was trying to record the expression of that person's interior temperament. Here's a word portrait of her friend, Mabel Dodge, another art collector, who had it bound as a pamphlet in beautiful Florentine wallpaper. And this is actually what provided the inspiration for our exhibition design. We have a couple of copies of this in the collection, and one of them you can see is dedicated to Etta Cohn. Now, Etta Cohn, with her sister, Dr. Claribel Cohn, were some of Gertrude's best friends back in Baltimore. The Cohn sisters, who donated, eventually donated their incredible art collection to the Baltimore Museum of Art, were adventurous art collectors, and they were a little bit older than Gertrude. They probably represented for her the kind of life she could imagine for herself as unmarried, independent, educated, globe-trotting women. But of course, the person who really stimulated Stein's creativity in this period was Alice B. Toklas. They met through mutual friends in 1907, and by 1908, they considered themselves married. Like Stein, Toklas was an educated, creative spirit from a middle-class Jewish family in California who also wanted to be free of the conventional expectations for women. So there's a postcard, what we call a real photo postcard on the left. That's actually from the Beinecke collection at Yale. That's from their honeymoon, what they thought of as their honeymoon in Venice. And you can see that it's been reproduced on the back cover of Alice's memoir on the right, which was published 55 years later. So word portraits helped Stein become more precise about the type of writer she wanted to be, but her increasing success in this genre also put her into the thick of this very messy, exciting artistic ferment in Paris, where there were plenty of geniuses, but only so many publishers and gallerists and producers to help you really get your work out. This encouraged all kinds of interesting and generative connections between participants in this scene, collaborations, friendships, rivalries, publishing exchanges. So I'm grouping them together under the heading of networks. So just a few examples of some of these just incredible stories of how people knew each other and how they were relating to each other. So here you see James Joyce's monumental semi-autobiographical novel, Ulysses, which is published in 1922 by a bookstore, actually, because people didn't want to take a risk on it, Shakespeare and Company. And Shakespeare and Company was run by a lesbian couple, Sylvia Beach and Adrienne Monnier. And it was printed, right? The actual printer of the text was this very, brave Frenchman from Dijon, Maurice Darntière. He was unfazed by the crazy English of James Joyce. And on the right, you see Stein's monumental semi-autobiographical novel called The Making of Americans, which was published in 1925, a couple of years later, by a poet, Robert McAlmon, who was married to a lesbian writer named Breyer, and he himself was bisexual. And this book was also printed by that same very, brave and tolerant Maurice Darntière. But what I love is that Stein has put the dates of composition on the front cover of her book, just so you know that she finished before James Joyce, even though the book was published afterwards. All right, it was common then, and it still is, to get people riled up to buy a big book, like The Making of Americans, by printing excerpts in the kinds of magazines that book buyers might read. And that is exactly what we see with the April 1924 issue of the Transatlantic Review. There was an excerpt of The Making of Americans in there. But look at the competition. That same issue also had contributions from Ford Maddox Ford, who was the editor of the magazine, the novelist, Juna Barnes. There's a piece by Ezra Pound, and there's Work in Progress by Joyce, who is by that time writing Finnegan's Wake, and the first story from what would become Ernest Hemingway's first book in our time. And Hemingway, of course, was famously one of Stein's proteges. And on the left, you see a letter in the Wilson collection in which Stein is cheering on Ford Maddox Ford for his editorial work with the journal. But alas, you can't make a lot of money as an editor and publisher for these avant-garde modernist writers, and the Transatlantic Review actually folded at the end of the year. Okay, so here is a letter, another letter from Stein to Bob Brown, Robert Carlton Brown, who was a best-selling fiction writer who became a modernist publisher. And he included Stein in his anthology called Reedies for Bob Brown's Machine. Reedies, that was a kind of machine that he invented for speed reading, supposedly. Speed reading to keep pace with the machine age. Most of the writers in the anthology took advantage of this premise to publish these texts, strange little texts that were like kind of printed in long strips, with the idea being that you would run them through the machine for speed reading. But Stein didn't. I guess she figured her writing was already in alignment with the machine age. Okay, another example. This is a really lovely one. This is an essay by Stein called Composition as Explanation that was published by the Hogarth Press. Now, the Hogarth Press was run by Leonard and Virginia Woolf. It was actually something that they started in part because it's almost as therapy for Virginia's depression. Virginia found setting type into the printing press kind of soothing. But what's really lovely is that this copy of her book, published by Virginia Woolf, is inscribed by Stein to Virginia Woolf. So quite a connection. All right, I think in the interest of time, we will skip this one, but we can talk about it later if you want. And we'll move on to this one. So, you know, this is a story of where sometimes these modernist networks didn't work out so well. In the 1920s, Stein became friends with these two Frenchmen, Georges Hunet and Georges Maratier. And they wanted to start a fine press for avant-garde works of literature, you know, beautifully illustrated, beautifully printed, intended to appeal to bibliophiles and others that they imagined would have the money to pay, you know, top dollar for a deluxe book. They called their press Édition de la Montagne, mountain, and you can see it in their printer's device right there. And they did publish 2 Stein texts, including these extracts from The Making of Americans, which was very important to her. But the productions of these books were so complicated with different illustrators and signed copies and gift copies, and people were not getting paid. And eventually there was a rupture, and Stein and the 2 Georges were no longer friends. So, you know, after that, Stein and Toklas decided to start their own press, which would basically be devoted to printing the works of Gertrude Stein. And they called it the Plain Edition, clearly a retort to the Mountain Press, right? Instead of being deluxe, they would be plain. And they sold a painting by Matisse to finance the enterprise, and they published 5 books, always working towards a never realized perfect balance between quality and economy. They wanted to really reach a lot of people, so they didn't want the books to be too expensive. I just didn't have room on the slide to show all 5 of them. So finally, in 1932, Stein decided to write something really different, unprecedented for her, something that would not require a lot of work on the part of readers, an autobiography purportedly by Alice Toklas. It was written in Alice's voice. It was hilariously dry, very gossipy, full of anecdotes about many artists and writers and musicians that they knew during the early 20th century in Paris, the First World War, the Roaring '20s. Readers loved it. It was serialized in the Atlantic magazine, where Stein had tried to get published for years, and it eventually led to a lecture tour in America, lots of magazine write-ups, a sequel. This is a fun photo by their friend Carl Van Vechten, taken as Alice and Gertrude get ready to go back to America for the first time in 30 years for the lecture tour. There's also a better one where Alice has her eyes open, but I like that they have both of them. Another thing about this book is, if you've read it, and if you haven't, I would say this is maybe the way to dip your toe into Stein's work, is it was so popular that it was one of the few books by Stein that actually always stayed in print. Lots of new editions, reprints, paperbacks, translations, up until actually really recently, a new one published in 2020. Well, okay, maybe not everyone loved it. Some of the people who were actually mentioned in the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas were kind of mad about the stories that she told about them and the little falsifications about their lives. They were so mad that they published a testimony against her. And this is actually led by the publishers of a magazine where she'd frequently published. So, kind of a big deal. All right, one more artistic network to mention, really important one, Stein's collaboration with the composer Virgil Thomson. It started in the late 1920s, but it really came to fruition in 1934 with the performance of the opera Four Saints in 3 acts. She wrote the libretto, he wrote the music. It was performed first in Hartford and then actually on Broadway by a cast of African-American singers. This is during the height of segregation on the American stage, so really kind of a breakthrough and quite popular. So The autobiography of Alceste Toklas and Four Saints and Three Acts really transformed Stein's reputation. Although she always had a few genuine fans, a lot of times people had kind of regarded her as, is this a hoax? What's going on here? Is she some kind of bohemian sibyl spouting words the rest of us don't understand? But with the more plain-spoken work of the autobiography and the sort of accessibility of Four Saints and Three Acts in music, and the lecture tour, of course, after the autobiography, she developed, kind of a more accessible reputation. And you can really see that on display here in this, on the cover of Time magazine. This is soon after the publication of the autobiography of Alceste Toklas. And I love this little cartoon here. This is typical of the parody that Stein was frequently subjected to, but I think this one's actually a little bit loving. So if you can see the train schedule there, making fun of her trademark repetitions, all the trains will be coming into the station late, late, late. And that cartoon is from one of Wilson's scrapbooks. He was really meticulous and diligent about compiling newspaper clippings, announcements, postcards, playbills, programs, brochures. It's really easy to get a sense of Stein's evolving reputation with this kind of direct evidence. So after the autobiography of Alceste Toklas, Stein finally got the support of the kind of mainstream publisher she'd always wanted, and that publisher was Random House. Of course, Random House wanted her to produce more bestsellers, and she kind of did. She published several works just during and right after the Second World War that were really like first-person accounts of her experience, and they were pretty popular. Here's the translation of Paris, France, clearly read to death. And she even had a story in Life magazine kind of about her encounters with the American GIs overseas during the war. Now, Stein had never really been overtly political. She wasn't vocal about LGBTQ rights. In her lifetime, there was almost universal prohibition, demonization, cruelty with regards to same-sex desire and gender nonconformity. And she wasn't really vocal about women's rights either. Maybe she felt that simply living her life as an independent, queer, Jewish woman and avant-garde artist was enough. But in the last major work of her life, she shifted gears significantly. This was another opera collaboration with Virgil Thompson called The Mother of Us All, about the 19th century American suffragist Susan B. Anthony, who in this opera voices the difficulty of struggling for equality and struggling for an equality that will not be realized, in her lifetime. It was first performed about a year after her death in 1946, and it gets revived, recorded and revived, particularly at important moments thereafter. A couple productions in 1971, and according to Wilson's ephemera, there was one in 2003. From the 1950s on, in fact, Stein was often a touchstone for later generations of avant-garde artists who often represented her work in theater and music pieces or created works that were inspired by hers. So, ironically, in this way, she was the mother of us all to several generations of feminist, queer, and avant-garde creators. And quite aside from that, she sort of kind of develops this interesting mainstream cult status in the 1970s and 80s. And these are some objects from Wilson's collection. He was just incredible about collecting these funny little commodities that heroized Stein. So whether you had read her work or not, knowing who Gertrude Stein was kind of a beacon, kind of a sign to yourself and others that you were onto her, that you were onto her politics as a feminist, retrospectively, right, through The Mother of Us All, a queer icon, just a symbol of artistic courage. There's a couple more things. I think, T-shirts, kind of goes on and on. But here are some of our favorite objects. I think probably people were sending him some of this stuff. And we found out at the opening of the exhibition a couple weeks ago that from one of his nieces, actually, that the pillow was probably given to him by his sister and was perhaps made locally in Baltimore. So that's something to investigate. All right, so of course, you know that one continual fan base for Gertrude Stein has been a succession of queer communities. And here I'm going to go backwards in time instead of forwards. So you probably noticed that the t-shirt on the previous slide is in the shape of a triangle, which was the most visually dominant symbol for LGBTQ rights, especially in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. The triangle recalls and reclaims the Nazi designations for homosexuals in the concentration camps. So it was like a reclamation of that symbol. The t-shirt says, the little pink part says, "I'm in good company," and it names several dozen gay, lesbian, and bisexual forebears, including Stein. Some other items that demonstrate this role that are just really adorable. Sammy Stewart, one of Stein and Toklas's protege, ended up writing a series of fan fiction mystery novels. There's a hunky gay protagonist, and then Stein and Toklas are like detectives who are working with him to solve crimes. And on a more serious note, on the right, this is a flyer from the early 1970s for a theater performance that was a benefit for a legal battle against an initiative in California. It was called the Briggs Initiative, that would have made it illegal for LGBTQ people to teach in the schools. It features, you can see that, a fake postcard between Gertrude and Alice. Going a little bit further back in time, here's a magazine article about Stein and Toklas from one of the early so-called homophile societies. These were the societies that existed in the 1950s and 60s before the Stonewall Inn uprising in 1969 that established the modern phase of the LGBTQ rights movement. So she was really a touchstone for queer folks in the second half of the 20th century. All right, so besides knowledge of Stein's life, what was this LGBTQ reception of Stein built on? One really important vehicle of her reputation and legacy was a novella called Things as They Are, published in 1950. And the story behind this publication is very poignant. After Stein's death in 1946, Toklas found a manuscript among her papers. She was going through everything, trying to organize stuff. And she realized that it was the first and most authentically autobiographical account of Stein's disappointed romantic interest from the turn of the 20th century, that love triangle that she had originally rewritten as Melanctha. And, Toklas hadn't known about this, so it must have been a little bit of a shock. But in this version, all three of the main characters are women, and the fact of same-sex love is really out in the open. And Toklas made the brave decision to publish it. And here it is reviewed in The Ladder, which was the newsletter of the Sisters of Bilitis, the first American social and political organization for queer women. Now that first edition, they actually lament its difficulty in this review of actually getting a copy, and you can sort of see that's rectified with this edition in 1971. Now, Stein had been making coded references to queer sexuality and feminism in her work all along. This is a famous story that actually, kind of flew under the radar in 1923. It was based on two real women, a couple. And in this story, Stein uses the word gay about 100 times. She's using it to, in that one sense of like happy, but she uses it so often, through the repetitions, that its meaning kind of subtly and gradually changes. People think this might be the first time that the word gay was really used as code to mean homosexual. Those coded references were necessary in public, but in private, Stein and Toklas had a great number of queer friends and kind of were especially notable as I think of them as like den mothers for a couple of generations of younger men who were gay and bisexual. And you can see testimonies to this in like the postcards and letters that they exchanged, photographs. So this is Paul Bowles's copy of a proof of one of her books with her postcards to him pasted in. Paul Bowles was a novelist and a composer who was mentored by Aaron Copland. And here's a letter from Stein to Paul Bowles, nicknamed Freddie. And the photographs were enclosed with it include pictures of Bowles and Copland. They were briefly lovers. And on the right is a birthday poem for Sammy Stewart, which you learned about in that book before. But of course, back to Alice. The most intimate queer community in Stein's life was the one she made with Alice. And in a lot of ways, Alice Toklas is the real hero in the story of Stein's legacy. She helped out quite a few of Stein's early collectors. You can see that in the correspondence that she had with a lot of them, including Robert Wilson, who went to visit her in the late 60s, shortly before she died. And, through that correspondence, she facilitated an important surge of posthumous publications that made Stein's work available to new generations. So she herself published 2 books after Stein's death, her famous cookbook and a memoir. This was her actual real memoir, unlike the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. And in both of these books, she continued to represent their lives, their lives together kind of with Stein at the center, Stein's work, Stein's personality at the center. And so even after Stein's death, she was sort of continuing the role she had played while Stein was alive. The familiar role of the wife in the background, the wife of the genius. This is an aspect of their relationship that my students, for example, really can't get their heads around. Why would she do this? And I think my students are onto something, because scholars are, I think, now starting to really recognize Toklas's important role in Stein's career. That she was a partner in her career as well as her partner in life. This is a self-portrait by Alice, one of the most beautiful things, I think, in the exhibition. Now, I mentioned that most of the items in this exhibition come from Wilson's collection, but there's one item in it that's absolutely new and unique, and maybe the best thing of all. It's a short video called Gertrude Stein in Baltimore by Natalie Wang, a Johns Hopkins undergrad who shot original footage of locations in Baltimore that were relevant to Stein's life, and mixed up that footage with archival audio recordings, some footage of archival items, and some animation magic to make this really beautiful and incisive insight into Stein's work. Okay, well, that was a lot. Thank you for sticking with me here. Before we move on to Q&A, I just want to let folks know about a couple of upcoming events. Both of these are in person. So if you're in Baltimore in mid-October or mid-November, please come on down to the Peabody Library. You can register at the link below, which is also the main website for this exhibition, where you can read our gallery guide and see more images from the exhibition.
Thanks, Gabrielle. Hi, everybody. I'm Paul Espinosa, and I'm here to facilitate the chat afterwards, or the question and answer for you. And we've already got some good ones that came in during the presentation. So I'll just go ahead and start with those. And Gabrielle, please feel free to answer. So Cindy asks, for somebody who's, and you mentioned this in the presentation a little bit, but for someone that's not familiar with Stein's work, where's a great place to start? And you mentioned Alice B. Toklas, but maybe the next one after that.
Oh yeah, I would say, okay, after Alice B. Toklas, I mean, I might read 3 Lives actually. And what was kind of groundbreaking about 3 Lives, aside from the presentation in Melanchtha, it's not without problems from a contemporary point of view. This is still a white writer talking about a Black character, drawing on some, scientific ideas that were racist, at the time. Nevertheless, Melanchtha is fully human, really exceeds the categories that even Stein is attempting, I think, to put around her. And it's also, all 3 of the stories are really trying to showcase women who are often invisible in literature. So it's not too like odd, in terms of the writing techniques.
Okay, great, thanks. We also have a question from Leanne. She's interested in Stein's art salons that she had in Paris, and I don't know if she had them elsewhere. But is there any representation of that, first of all, in the exhibit, and what scholarship is around her art salons?
Well, yes, we did want to represent that in the exhibit. And again, we're really lucky to, partner with our good friends over at the Baltimore Museum of Art in this regard. So in the Cohn papers, the collection of the two Cohn sisters, Etta and Claribel, which is that set of materials is at the BMA. There are a number of really fabulous photographs that I think Stein, Gertrude, Leo, or Michael, they all took photos of their art collection. And scholars have been drawing on these photos to identify which paintings they had and when they had them. And there's a couple of these photos in the Cohn papers. So we have mounted some reproductions of some of those photos on the walls in the gallery, and you can kind of see a little bit their evolving collection. I would say one of the best books about this it's from 2012, and it's actually the exhibition catalog for a show that was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in that year. It's called The Steins Collect. And it was a kind of they gathered together a lot of the paintings and other works that the three siblings, plus Michael's wife, Sarah, had built. What's interesting is that this was not the first time a show about the Stein collection, I mean, that was a really big show. It went to, after the Met, I think it went to Paris, but in 1971, I think it was 71 or 74, there were a couple of big shows about the Stein siblings collections, and we have posters and other materials about those art shows too. But yeah, it's called the Steins Collect, and it's got a lot of reproductions of those photos as well. So you can see images of their art collection and photos of the art collection on their walls back in the day.
Okay, thanks. We have a question from Peggy. She asked what first piqued your interest in Gertrude Stein, and do you have a favorite piece in the show, or maybe a piece that opened your eyes to an aspect of Stein that you didn't know about before?
I can't remember what first piqued my interest in Gertrude Stein, but I'm guessing it was probably the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. It's just so fun. And and this can be, and one aspect of it is both fun and maybe irritating, is it's full of names. My students are like, what's with the name dropping? But we looked everybody up, and it's pretty an interesting exercise in realizing, who's still a familiar name to us, in the art world from that time, and who has not. It's a real insight into sort of fashions in art and literature. But it's a really fun read. I guess, gosh, favorite piece in the show. I mean, I love the pillow. I love the self-portrait by Alice. I love a lot of the things. It's so hard to pick a favorite. There wasn't room for everything. And one thing that was eye-opening about Gertrude Stein is, I think I can advance to this picture. I brought pictures of it just in case. So in the late 1930s, the children's author, Margaret Wise Brown, you may have heard of her if you've ever had to read Goodnight Moon, or The Little Island 1,000 times to a child before bed. So that Margaret Wise Brown, she loved Gertrude Stein, had been influenced by Gertrude Stein, and she invited Gertrude Stein to contribute a manuscript to a new children's book imprint that Margaret Wise Brown was editing. And so that manuscript was called The World is Round. And you can see she's using her famous dictum, "Rose is a rose is a rose is a rose," that actually comes from a different work, but she kind of used it as her motto for a while. And she kind of extends it in this book because the title character is a little girl named Rose. And Rose is learning about the fact that there are planets that go around the sun in a circle and that are themselves circles, and that rotate, right? A lot of circles. This book was also kind of a big influence in, like the title of our exhibition, the colors of our exhibition. We used a pink a little bit different from this one. But there was just so many things. It's sort of an outlier in terms of Stein's work. So we didn't put it in the main exhibition, but it is a couple of books, a couple of editions, I guess, of The World is Round are on display at the Evergreen Museum and Library right now, so people can see it if they want.
Okay, thanks, Gabrielle. We're running up against the clock at this point. We've had some great questions. So I'll just summarize a couple of things. So somebody asked about how much of the exhibit is books versus ephemera. I would say it's a lot of both. There's a lot of objects here. Somebody asked, would anybody ever be able to open and touch and see any of this material? And I think the short answer is yes. This is just sort of the tip of the iceberg in terms of the quality and quantity of the collection. We as librarians and curators are here to help you do that. So don't be afraid to ask, and you can always sit with some of this material. Other than that, somebody asked a real quick question, maybe Gabrielle, just a yes or no. Did Richard ask, did Stein know Amy Lowell? Do you know that name?
Yes, I know that name. And that's a really good question. And I kind of think that they did not, but that's actually been in the back of my mind of something I need to investigate.
Okay. So good research.
Yeah, thank you for the new step in the research. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, with that, I think I will close it out. Just everybody know that the exhibit will be up through March 2nd. Our hours for the gallery are Sundays 11 to 5, and then Monday through Thursday 10 to 5 here at the George Peabody Library. It's always best to check the hours ahead of time. You may know that occasionally we have to close a little early for events throughout the year, but we're as open as we can be for everybody to come and see the exhibit. So there'll be plenty of good opportunities to do that. With that, I'll thank everybody, and I'll thank Gabrielle. And Gabrielle, if you have anything parting words, maybe the date of the next program. Oh, here they are.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, so we're having an in-person gallery tour a week from today, and on November 20th, this is carefully calibrated to be after the election, a conversation with Phoebe Stein about Gertrude Stein's America. And Phoebe Stein is both a Stein cousin. I can't remember the genealogy, but like she's the descendant of one of Stein's cousins, and a Stein scholar. So we're going to talk about how Gertrude Stein, who was so aligned with Paris, was always felt herself to be very thoroughly American, and kind of what that means for the way we understand her.
Okay, thanks everybody for joining us, and have a good rest of the day.